morning.
Good morning.
Hundreds and hundreds of years, perhaps as many as 2,000 years before Jesus' birth, there was a man who had 12 sons, and among those 12 sons, he had a favorite son, and he loved his favorite son so much that he gave his favorite son a beautiful coat. And then a series of unfortunate events befell the son, and he eventually ended up in a prison in Egypt. And he had been given a gift by his father of this coat. That wasn't the only gift he had been given. He was also given a gift of God, where he had dreams. God spoke to him in dreams, and God gave him the ability to interpret the dreams of other people. And he was able to interpret the dream of Pharaoh. And because he interpreted it correctly, he ended up becoming the hero and the second most important person in Egypt, and his name was Joseph. Joseph became so important, he brought his whole family over. His father was born Jacob, and his name was changed to Israel. And so the children of Israel came to Egypt. These, you might call them Israelites eventually. And these Israelites, over several hundreds of years, the family grows, as families tend to do over hundreds of years. And this family, which was now becoming a nation, was becoming so large, so great, that a new Pharaoh, who had somehow forgotten all that Joseph had done for them, was fearful of them and worried that they were going to take over the place. And so this new Pharaoh sought to subjugate the children of Israel to the point where he ordered the murder of all of their male children by being thrown into the river. One child, at least, that we know of, was saved from that fate. His parents, especially his mother, saved his life by putting him in the river, by putting him in a little basket. And an Egyptian princess drew him out of that water. His name was Moses. Moses grows up. He ends up leaving Egypt for decades. He then ends up coming back to Egypt on a mission to save God's people, this family, this children of Israel. And he does save them, and they leave Egypt, and they go into the wilderness on their way to a land that had been promised them. And the first major thing that Moses does when he reaches the wilderness, and the people are free and they're out of Egypt in the clutches of Pharaoh, is he goes up a high mountain and communes with God. And there God gives him the law, and in particular the 10 commandments. And he comes down the mountain with these commandments etched on tablets of stone to present them to the people. These commandments were meant to be a mark of identity. These people had never been their own people for hundreds of years. They didn't know what it was like to not have to answer to someone else, to have their own freedom. And so God helped them with an identity. We are going to be the kind of people that honor God and no other. We are going to be the kind of people who do not make graven images, who honor the Sabbath day, who do not take the name of the Lord our God in vain. We're not going to murder. We're not going to steal. We're not going to go back on our most solemn commitments. Hundreds of years later, about 1,500 years later, a fellow named Matthew sits down to write a story of Jesus that he calls a gospel. And in his gospel, he adds some details into the life of Jesus that we don't get from Mark or Luke or John. They are unique to Matthew. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus' father, whose name is Joseph, was a dreamer. God spoke to him in dreams. God spoke to him in a dream saying, your wife is going to have a child, even though you're not married yet. He then spoke to him in a dream saying that your child is in danger and you must flee. God spoke to him in dreams just like God spoke to his namesake some 2,000 years prior. God warned the father in a dream because another despotic ruler sought to kill all of the male children in the region. It's like history is happening again, right? And again, there is at least one child who is spared. Because God speaks to Joseph in that dream, and Joseph and Mary and Jesus go off to flee the country, to flee this despotic ruler, and they go to Egypt. And they stay there for a while until the coast is clear, and then they come back from Egypt, like making a mini exodus. And then this Jesus grows up, and he is baptized, and the first major thing that he does in his ministry in the Gospel of Matthew is he climbs a high mountain and he offers his first great sermon. You could almost call it like a sermon on a mountain, or maybe like the Sermon on the Mount or something like that. You see all those parallels, right? I mean, Matthew wrote his, I don't believe that Matthew made up those details, but I believe that Matthew curated those details to tell his people that Jesus is like a new Moses. That the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus, that whole event is like a new Exodus, where we are being drawn not into a geographic land, but we are being drawn into the kingdom of God, which in the Gospel of Matthew, the kingdom of God, which is talked about over and over and over again, is not talked about as a future thing, but a present reality. Jesus never says the kingdom of God will be like. He says the kingdom of God is like this. And then he gives a parable talking about what the kingdom is like right now, right here, where we're at. I go through all of that because we do have a tendency when it comes to the Sermon on the Mount, and particularly the Beatitudes, to over-sentimentalize them. They're so sweet. They're so lovely. You can go on Etsy today and buy a coffee mug with the Beatitudes etched on them. You can get a pillow with these words embroidered on the front that you can stick nicely on your couch because they're nice and they're sweet and they're comforting. But when Matthew wrote the Sermon on the Mount, and he had all of those parallels with the Exodus, this is the parallel of Moses on the mountaintop. Think about that image of Moses coming down the mountain with those 10 commandments. It's an image of power and wonder and connection with God like never before. When Matthew wrote these words down, that's what he had in mind. These aren't just sweet, sentimental thoughts that we can just feel comforted with. They're powerful words. And just like the 10 Commandments were all about giving the Israelites a new sense of identity. We're the kind of people who live like this. The Beatitudes are the same thing. They are marks of identity. This is the kind of people that we are to be. I used to think years ago, and perhaps you thought this too, when reading the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, I always thought that Jesus was talking about this other group of people out there somewhere. Like somewhere out there, there's the poor in spirit, and they're pretty blessed, and they're going to get the kingdom of heaven. And somewhere else out there, there's the merciful, and somewhere there's the peacemakers, and that Jesus was like blessing them. Jesus isn't talking about other groups of people. He's talking about us. He's talking about the characteristics of the citizens of the kingdom of God. These words, these Beatitudes, with such power spoken from the mountaintop are meant to evoke something within us. They are meant to be descriptive. We are to be the poor in spirit. This is the one I'm going to just talk about just for a moment, because I think it's probably the hardest to understand. When you hear blessed are the poor in spirit, you think, well, aren't like the rich in spirit supposed to be blessed? Are we supposed to be like deeply spiritual people? When I think about this particular, the first beatitude, I think about the holiest people I ever had the privilege of knowing, the people that were just deeply spiritual and deeply connected to God. And those people were never walked around like, well, I'm super religious. They never walked around saying, well, I got God all figured out, and I'm super spiritual. The people who tend to be the most spiritual also tend to be the most humble. As if the more they understand God, the more they go into the deeper mysteries of God, the more they realize they don't know, the more they realize that there is a poverty there. It's to me, the poor in spirit is a marker of humility and faith. We are to be those who mourn, not those with hard hearts who have things happen in our life or see things happen in the world and we don't allow our hearts to be supple and brave, but we are the ones who look at injustice and hurt and pain and death, and it brings us to weep. We are to be the meek. We are to be those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, not those who hunger and thirst for power and control over others, but those who are meek and hunger for what is right. We are to be the merciful, those who don't just give people what they deserve, however terrible a thing they did to us, but we are the ones who are to extend a hand of grace and mercy and forgiveness to them. We are to be the pure of heart and the peacemakers, not the peace allowers, the peace letters, the ones who fold our hands and stand back, and the peace is going to happen. That's perfectly fine. No, we're the peacemakers, the ones who make peace in our homes, in our families, in our communities, in our workplaces, in our church, in our nation, in the world. We put in the work to make peace happen. If you were to sort of use the Beatitudes like almost a report card of yourself, I know if I were to do that, I would not get an A. There are some of these that I kind of go, ooh. I do walk around saying I'm super religious, so I gotta work on that. What's that? Maybe it's the collar. Here's what I'll say, is that when Moses came down the mountaintop with the 10 Commandments that God had given him, it wasn't descriptive in the present sense. He wasn't saying this is the people we've always been. The people weren't always following the commandments of God. He's saying this is who we're going to be. And then if you read the rest of the Hebrew Bible, the rest of the Old Testament, you see every single chapter, the people struggling to live up to those commandments. And sometimes not even struggling. They're breaking the commandments with absolute glee. But the commandments were there almost as aspiration. This is who we're going to aspire to be. This is who God is calling us to be. This is what is being evoked out of us. That is the Beatitudes. Don't look at the Beatitudes sentimentally, but also don't look at the Beatitudes with shame. Like, oh gosh, I totally missed that one and that one and that one. No, today, on All Saints Sunday, we are being called into them. God invites us today, just like he invited us yesterday, and just like God will invite us tomorrow, to live into this identity, to live into our identity as the citizens